Over the last 5 decades, the Brazilian economy has been on a virtual roller coaster. Periods of strong economic growth and high expectations have been followed by crises, devaluations, and even hyperinflation. This is what happened in the late 1980s, for example. In 1989, Brazil experienced 1,320% inflation, and in 1990, 2,740%. The result is that, 50 years after experiencing what became known as the Brazilian miracle, Brazil has still not managed to take the leap forward it needs to become a developed country. Still, over the past few decades, Brazil has attracted investment from many companies, and in many financial circles, it has come to be considered one of the great hopes among emerging economies. Have you ever heard of the BRICS? I'm sure you have. So, why have we chosen to talk about Brazil in this new collaboration with Value School? Well, we have done this firstly to find out when and why the Brazilian economy became so popular, and secondly, because we want to answer 3 key questions. Firstly, can stock markets help small investors protect themselves from periods of crisis, political upheaval, and the processes of high inflation and even hyperinflation that are so common in many emerging countries? Secondly, what does the case of Brazil tell us about all this? And thirdly, can the case of Brazil teach us anything about how to best apply the processes of economic reform? We will try to answer all these questions, but first, the first thing we have to do is find out where this story begins, the origin of this particular roller coaster that we see today. Before we get started though, I just want to remind you about our new channel, Visual Academy. It covers all the most interesting people, places, and periods in history. Do you want to know more about Genghis Khan, or the ancient Greeks, or maybe even the Vikings? Of course you do. Those are cool times in history. So check them out with amazing animations, fantastic stories, and a voiceover from someone you might recognize. Check out Visual Academy here on YouTube. And now, let's get cracking.
Brazil's economic miracle.
The period from the end of the 1960s to the end of the 1970s has come to be known as Brazil's economic miracle. Although, as we will see, it was not really a miracle at all. We're talking about a complex, difficult period, a period marked by a military dictatorship, repression, and persecution of any political and social movement that was not properly aligned with the military bodies in power. However, in spite of everything, during those years, the economy also registered enormous economic growth. These are known as the years of lead. To give you an idea, in 1968, Brazil's GDP was growing at 9.8%, and by 1973, this growth reached an astonishing 14%. However, beyond the economic growth that the country registered during the first years of the dictatorship, the truth is that the bases for this growth were not the best. The military government stimulated the arrival of foreign capital, and measures were implemented to protect financial investments. But they also bet on stimulating internal demand through the execution of large infrastructure works. We are talking about projects such as the Itaipu Mega Hydroelectric Plant, the Trans-Amazonian Highway, and the Angara Nuclear Power Plant, all financed with public money and debt. What's more, in 1964, the military created the Central Bank of Brazil, which they did not hesitate in using to finance their enormous public works projects. As a result, during the military reign, Brazil's foreign debt multiplied by 30, and inflation grew and exceeded 34% in 1974. So, when the first oil crisis broke out in 1973, crude oil quadrupled in price at the exact same time that international credit became scarce. That's when the Brazilian economy began to have problems. In just 2 years, GDP growth was reduced by 10 points. Despite this, the military government decided to continue with its huge public spending plans to try and boost the economy. And that only made the economy even more vulnerable. So, in 1979, when a new oil crisis followed the Iranian Revolution, Brazil's economy faced another severe blow. Economic growth practically disappeared. It simply vanished. Income from raw materials plummeted, the foreign debt had to be renegotiated at ever higher and higher interest rates, and the government accounts no longer added up, either above or below the line. Not on one side, nor on the other. The Brazilian economy was headed for disaster. And that pretty much described exactly What happened? Unable to resort to foreign credit and with a growing imbalance in public accounts, the government turned to the central bank for financing. And, my friends, that was the beginning of the end. Inflation soon exceeded 100% per year, and various attempts to stabilize the situation did not work. In the end, the economic crisis itself led to the fall of the military government in 1985. Of course, the advent of democracy did not bring prosperity either. In 1987, the Brazilian government suspended their loan payments, and between 1989 and 1993, the country practically lived under constant hyperinflation. Check this out.
When I was 10-year-old in the 1980s in Brazil, my job was to run through the supermarket aisles to pass adults who, armed with labeling machines so large that they made us laugh, wandered around the place raising prices throughout the day. Rodrigo Zaidan, professor of economics and finance at the New York University in Shanghai.
At the same time, during the first 3 years of the 1990s, the GDP per capita plummeted by 10%. And so, we arrive at 1994, the year in which what has perhaps been the most ambitious plan for reform in Brazil's history was launched.
The Real Plan.
The Real Plan, initiated by Fernando Henrique Cardoso, first as Minister of Finance and later as President of Brazil, aims to go much further. Cardoso's plan sought to completely transform the reality of the Brazilian economy by means of the privatization of the public sector, financial system reforms, attracting foreign investment, and the opening up of the Brazilian economy to the world through Mercosur. But the first task was undoubtedly to contain the wild hyperinflation that the country was suffering. In an attempt to achieve price stability, the government launched a rapid action program that aimed to end the budgetary imbalance in the public accounts and, immediately afterwards, established a new monetary standard, the real value unit, the value of which was linked to the US dollar, and which was assigned a fixed daily rate in the central bank. Little by little, wages, rates, and prices were quoted using this new value unit. And finally, on the 1st of June 1994, the real value unit became the new currency of Brazil, commonly referred to as the real. And you know what? The effects on inflation were immediate. While during the first two financial quarters of 1994, inflation registered for an average increase of, wait for it, more than 40% per month, after the introduction of the real, this was reduced to just over 3% during the second half of the year. Inflation gradually declined until 1998, when it registered an annual increase of only 2.6%. Take a look. So, first objective achieved. The next goal was to restructure and recapitalize the entire financial system, an operation that was led by the state itself through PROER, the program to stimulate the restructuring and strengthening of the national financial system. This was a program where the government intervened in financial entities that presented problems. These entities were then given credit facilities. The state bought the unpaid loans they had on their balance sheets and finally sold the entities, in many cases to large international banking groups. Between 1994 in July and December in 1998, 76 banks were liquidated or transferred. It was at precisely this time that both Banco Santander and the then BBV, Banco Babílio Vecasa, entered Brazil through the purchase of Brazilian banks that had been the objects of the government intervention. So far, so good. The fact is that, after inflation was brought under control and the financial restructuring and privatization programs of public enterprises had begun, local conditions in the eyes of international investors improved significantly. Suddenly, Brazil became fashionable and foreign capital began to pour into the country. For example, Telefónica, a Spanish telecommunications operator that is the largest operator in Brazil today, entered the country in 1998 with the purchase of the public company Telcep. To give you an idea of the scale of this move, it is estimated that between 1993 and 1998, the Brazilian government raised a total of $68 billion from the sale of public companies. That's $1 billion with a B. Well, at that time, everything seemed to be going smoothly. However, the truth was that the Brazilian roller coaster soon started up again. The question is, would things turn out differently for Brazil this time? To find out, listen up.
All paths lead to here.
Everything seemed to be going smoothly and at full speed. However, little by little, things got more complicated. In the first place, the plan had the initial objective of improving public accounts, but what happened was actually the opposite. The new social commitments brought about by democracy, the growing weight of the pension system, and financial restructuring all triggered public debt. To give you an idea, the financial reform alone cost the public coffers around $100 billion. And not only that, since one of the government's objectives to boost economic growth was to attract foreign capital, it maintained a policy of very high interest rates, which greatly increased the cost of that public debt. This, in turn, forced the state to issue large amounts of debt in order to finance itself. Thus, in only 4 years, between 1994 and 1998, the Brazilian public debt increased threefold, while the public deficit climbed to 7.4% of the fixed GDP. And this leads us directly to the second problem. The combination of high interest rates with huge issuances of public debt created what is known as crowding out, a massive crowding out. The savings of Brazilians and the huge influx of foreign capital were mainly directed to the purchase of public debt. After all, why take risks with other investments when you can simply buy government debt and get a huge return? This crowding out phenomenon was so great that despite the enormous amount of capital Brazil received from the rest of the world, companies found it increasingly difficult to obtain credit. And not only that, many of the country's large companies began to direct their resources towards the purchase of public debt too. At that time, buying government securities was more profitable than reinvesting in their own businesses. This may seem incredible, but to a large extent this is what explains why, between 1993 and 2003, the rate of return for the 500 largest Brazilian companies was to increase by 80%, while their investment only increased by 3.8% per year. The search for easy and apparently secure rents drove capital not towards new investment projects, but basically towards the purchase of public debt, a textbook case of what is known in economics as the crowding out effect. In the end, the opening up to the outside world, together with a lack of concrete measures to boost the competitiveness of local companies, only added to this crowding out effect, and an exchange rate inflated by a policy of high interest rates caused the bank account balance to reverse and enter negative territory. The result was that foreign debt began to grow again. And then, along came 1998, the year of both the Russian crisis and the Asian crisis. These crises made foreign capital begin to flow out of the emerging economies at full speed. In 1999, the Brazilian economy had to be rescued. The IMF, together with the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and several countries that offered to be part of the rescue group, had to put in more than $40 billion on the table. Even so, when the Central Bank of Brazil was forced to let the Brazilian real float freely, the currency lost more than 60% of its value. The roller coaster was rolling again. That was until the next commodity boom between 2000 and 2014, and soon after, another huge crisis from which the country has still not recovered. The Brazilian economy has really had its ups and downs. But at this point, I'm sure many of you are thinking, well, Grant, if this video was made in collaboration with Value School, you must be about to tell us what happened with the stock market. So just what on earth did happen to the financial markets during this time? Well, the truth is that the Brazilian stock market followed practically the same steps as the national economy, and especially those of foreign capital flows into the country. As you can see in this graph, in just 2.5 years between the beginning of 1995 and the middle of 1997, the Bovespa index of the Brazilian stock market increased by a factor of 3. In any case, the most surprising fact is that during the last 50 years, and in spite of all the ups and downs, crises and hyperinflations that Brazil has experienced, the Brazilian stock market has reaped a real return. That is, corrected for inflation, of 6.7%. To illustrate this better, let's take the case of two hypothetical investors who, in 1968, would have invested the equivalent of 100 reais in today's money. Let's say the first investor invested his money in bank deposits, while the second invested in an exchange-traded fund, or ETF, indexed to Bovespa. Well, today, the first one would have absolutely nothing, while the second one would have investments worth $2,573. I guess that proves the power of equities. In short, this is the story of how Brazil became fashionable, how it defeated hyperinflation, and how the roller coaster returned in spite of everything. With this story, we wanted to put two ideas on the table. The first is that you have to be very careful with trends and with reform processes. They are not always the panacea they seem to be. If they are not well mapped out, the results can be very disappointing. The second is that, despite everything, investing in equities was the best way for Brazilians to protect their long-term savings. Now, you understand better why the mission of our friends over at Value School is precisely to promote financial culture. So, we really hope you enjoyed this video. Please hit like if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Don't forget to check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast too. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not my dulcet tones. Also, this channel is possible because of Patreon and our kind patrons on that platform. Please consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And, as always, I'll see you next time.
And if you want to learn more about politics and hear even more of my lovely voice, you can join us at Reconsider Media. We have a podcast at reconsidermedia.com/podcast. See you there.